Hello? Can you hear me? Good morning, good evening, good afternoon. I don't know where you are. Wherever you are, welcome to the College of Foreign Language and Literature at Kyunghee University. This is Manifestos for an International University. We are live on YouTube, and I'm just going to say it's been a very emotional couple of hours trying to establish a connection. So hopefully you're all there, you're all hearing me, and establishing a connection with Australia as well has been something of an experience. But we live and learn, and we live in very interesting times too. Just a quick health and safety announcement for our audience. Please observe social distancing. Please check our website for updates. It may be the case in future that there are some alterations that we need to make to the schedule. Not strictly speaking to the schedule, but the some of the links that you have access to that are already scheduled on YouTube. It's possible that we may need to make some slight changes to that schedule. So do please keep checking on YouTube and on our website for updates. I'm not going to talk very much more now. I'd really like us to get down to business and hear from our speaker. Justin Clemens is Associate Professor in the School of Culture and Communication at the University of Melbourne. His books, of which there are many, include Lacan, Deleuze, Badiou, with A.J. Bartlett and John Roth. Psychoanalysis is an anti-philosophy. And the erudite, witty, deeply weird mock epic poem, The Mundiad. I should also mention Villain, Justin's collection of poetry in free verse, inspired by the French vagabond François Villon. Justin was the founding secretary of the Lacan School of Melbourne. He was for many years art critic of The Monthly. Justin is a philosopher, has written widely on psychoanalysis, art, social theory, literature. And last but not least, Justin was one of the first writers and translators of the French philosopher Alain Badiou, way back actually, in the late 90s. Justin, along with Sam Gillespie, was, I suppose, partly responsible for introducing Badiou to the wider Anglophone world. So Justin is a man of many talents. It's a great pleasure to welcome him today. I'm delighted that he's agreed to join us and talk to us. I look forward to a discussion afterwards if there's time. Please, if you're on YouTube, don't be afraid. Ask questions, put the questions in the chat box and I'll relay them to Justin. But for the moment, it gives me great pleasure to say, Justin, welcome to Manifestos for an International University, and over to you.
Well, thank you, Jason, and thank you, Kyunghee University, for the invitation to speak at this sequence. And it's also as always an honour to go on after A.J. Bartlett, who gave the first talk last week, and who will also be mentioned in the course of this talk. But it's if there's a title for this presentation today, it's on not dying from shame at the end of the university. The word university, in the sense of a dedicated research and teaching institution, is perhaps surprisingly old. Attested in a number of still recognizable forms in English from around 1300, including university, universis, and university, among others, its origins are relatively clear and distinct. It enters most of the Western European languages from Old French, where it seems to have been first used in the early 13th century to designate a community or corporation, but quickly is applied to an assembly of scholars engaged in giving and receiving instruction, as well as totality, universality, and by the late 14th century, even to the whole of creation itself. The word universe, evidently based on the same Latin root, is again perhaps surprisingly only much later attested in early modern languages, though it in other ways predates them. As the reformist and classicist George Dyer says in the course of his rambling and unreliable History of the University and Colleges of Cambridge, this is a quote, "The word university was used in a metaphysical and philosophical sense by ancient writers, long before it was taken in an ecclesiastical or monastic sense, and by ecclesiastical and monastic bodies before it was introduced into an academical society. A mother cathedral church with its officers and dependent churches, as well as a mother abbey with its dependent religious houses, was called universitas." End of quote. The university as an institution, as John Barth, the novelist, also recognized in his satirical novel Giles Goatboy, shares its name with the universe itself, potentially humorously, yet absolutely earnestly. The university is first and foremost an ontological enterprise, as they say, a multiplicity turned or turning towards the one, or alternatively, the turning of the one itself, the one turning, or indeed, all of these at the same time. The progress of the idea of the universe to its incarnation as the name for an ecclesiastical body, to the academic university as a place which studies the universals of the universe itself, is itself a world historical progression. The university concerns itself with studying the universe of which it is a part, hence the question of knowledge, as it also simultaneously concerns itself with the transmission and application of this knowledge. The concomitant necessity of teaching how to know and knowing how to teach, how knowing and teaching are to be known and taught, is also integrally the question of the organization of the university as an institution, how it articulates what we could call the one many of knowing, the one many of teaching, and the one many of binding. This fundamental reflexive compact never loses. Indeed, it lives off the vicissitudes of the one, even as this one itself constitutively mutates and diversifies, shatters and coalesces into virulently incommensurable forms. The university and the question or problem or operation of the one are absolutely inseparable. What is a one? Is the one or is the one not? How many ones are there? Which one is in question? And so on. These may be metaphysical questions par excellence, but they are also at the very center of the history and becoming of the university as a real institution. Stephen Knight identifies 5 major shifts in these travails of the university over the last millennium, and the university is closed for open day. The first is the Catholic University, the unionizing of the monks, scholars, and students into the phenomenon that produced the Aristotelian theology of high scholasticism. The medieval universities of Bologna and Paris and Oxford were themselves formed and reformed through the struggles of working masters and students who, under the return of the Greek philosopher, by way of the Islamic scholars, found themselves simultaneously in struggles for employment while seeking to re-establish what was orthodoxy and what was heresy. This university canonizes the lecture, the question, the disputation, the treatise as its primary means and modes of communication. It teeses continuously on the brink of heresy over authority. It is susceptible to disruptions and interventions at every point, from scholars, students, church, and state. The second shift is to the Protestant university, the university of anti-Aristotelian dissent, bourgeois individualism, and secularized humanism, dedicated to pagan classics and the new sciences, which of course would not enter the old halls without great violence. Such a university purports to a real-world pragmatism. As Lord Chancellor Francis Bacon, one of the great ideologues of the new institutions of scholarship, as he emphasized, it hence seeks to rupture with the prevailing organizations and their theocratic hierarchies. Along Baconian lines, all inherited knowledges and the rhetoric that accompanies them needs to be treated with suspicion. Pragmatic, technical, and testable new principles for producing and assessing true knowledge must be laid out. Such knowledge is in principle indefinite, infinite, is directed towards power over nature, very famously in Bacon's phrase. Its graduates of this university are to be groomed for state administration, for private business, including import-exports as well as playwriting, and as ever, for the religious professions. The third shift is to that of the modern research university. Its emblematic site is the University of Berlin, founded by Humboldt after a competition to which many of the great German idealists contributed their proposals. This is the University of Wissenschaft, of the French Encyclopedia and the German Enlightenment. As Zachary Purvis puts it, among other factors, the most important was that Kantian and post-Kantian German idealist philosophy served as a midwife for the Wissenschafts ideology. Such a university is in fact a highly organized, disciplinarily divided university centered around the black hole of idealist metaphysics, in which being and nothingness, the one and the many, scintillate in a ringing mirror play that, subtracted from any knowledge, it can itself be simply reduced to know-how, nonetheless founds and fuels the ongoing powers of research and teaching to the benefit of the state, of the economy, and finally of metaphysics itself. The catch cry of knowledge for its own sake is thereby perfectly integrated with its apparent antithesis, knowledge for use. Elsewhere, I've myself argued that the question of the university and modernity from the 19th century onwards has been an institution that circulates between institutions themselves, aesthetics, and nihilism. The fourth shift is to what Knight calls the modern quality university, whose emblem is that of the wealthy, expansionist post-World War II North American institutions, which of course provide models for a number of post-war institutions around the world. And affects institutions globally from France to Australia, to Brazil to Korea. Without radically transforming the stated liberal ambitions of existing university systems, the tertiary sector, as we now call it, comes to be massively expanded throughout the world as a matter of political and economic priority. Hence, the great Michel Foucault, even as he radically and rigorously forged new techniques of analysis and intervention against the structures of the state university system, its operations, its actuality, and its histories, was also a major functionary engaged in the expansion of French universities in the 1960s. As Paul Cohen notes, it was Hélène Cixous, on advice from Jacques Derrida, who, after gathering a team comprising Roland Barthes, Jacques Lacan, Georges Canguilhem, and Derrida himself, and here's a quote from Cohen, hired Michel Foucault to build the philosophy department into what would become the intellectual crown jewel of Vincennes. Foucault wanted innovative thinkers who, like himself, practiced philosophy outside the hidebound terms in which it was taught at the Sorbonne. He was equally committed to ensuring political openness and diversity, which for a university on the left in those turbulent days meant striking a fine balance between Maoists, Trotskyists, and members of the Stalinist French Communist Party. End of quote. For his part, Knight speaks to the radicals of the Sydney University of the late 1960s, who once proposed forming the People's University of Balmain, suburb of Sydney, with its winning acronym PUB. What these new expansionist universities retained from the University of Berlin or the exclusive superior schools of post-Napoleonic France, or indeed maybe the Wordsworthy and English universities, was, perhaps despite appearances, a thoroughly metaphysical and revolutionary bent. Revolutionary precisely insofar as it disavowedly sought to curb and fold such energies back into the service of the state itself. In other words, whatever the reputation that still lingers regarding the student riots of the 1960s, they were essentially tied to the effects of inclusion and integration of hitherto unprecedented numbers and kinds of persons into the university as such. Despite what such grand historical schemata as the one I just offered might elide or misjudge, they can nonetheless serve to illuminate crucial ruptures and continuities. It's the continuities that concern us here. First and foremost, the university is always in a relation to the state. even if that relation is fraught, contested, inverted, and even if what counts as the state itself radically mutates over time. As Louis Althusser would say, the university is one of the most important and successful ideological state apparatuses of post-feudal Europe. Second, the university was so by functioning as a locus of the coupling of teaching and research. It establishes and maintains what is to count as knowledge and the proper application and transmission of that knowledge. Third, it does so by concentrating large numbers of young people in a particular site, a site organised according to self-professedly particular laws and routines that constitute and express exception to those of ordinary life. And let us not forget that for most of its history, the university was exclusively masculine. As Althusser would surely also add, the university is a relatively autonomous zone. Fourth, these students are to be reflexively epistemized. That is, they are to be brought to know that their actions are to be known by themselves in the terms that the university knows of what constitutes knowledge. Fifth, this site is temporalized, insofar as it is expressly a transition point for most, if not all, of its intake. It constitutes a transient filter for those it nominally educates. You come into the university and you leave the university. Very important, it's a transitional zone. Sixth, the university is accordingly a site of contestation over the status of its own site and the utterances of and in that site. So the university has always been divided against itself in fundamental ways. Town and gown, masters and students, academic and non-academic staff, etc. And such divisions have been crucial to precisely its unifying mission. There is and has never been a university without diversity. Student riots, for example, have been a staple feature for nearly 1,000 years. Yet another has been the declared enthusiasm for abandoning the university altogether, which of course, as I mentioned before, is one of the key goals of the university itself. In his seminar 17, The Other Side of Psychoanalysis, delivered in 1969-1970, and accompanying the establishment of Paris 8, the University Vincennes, Jacques Lacan introduced his famous 4 discourses, those of the master, the hysteric, the analyst, and the university, which he formalizes in his little mathemes. The University Discourse is written like this, and hopefully Jason will be able to fantastic, thank you, Jason. So we have on the left-hand side S2 over S1, and an arrow pointing to, on the right side, a little a, the object pétillard over the barred subject, the sigil for the barred subject. Now, as you are likely already aware, S1 for Lacan means the master signifier. S2 are chains of signifiers, the chains of knowledge. The little a is the object A, the object cause of desire, and the slashed S is the divided subject. That is whatever supports a signifying process. Here, in this discourse, they occupy the positions, respectively, of truth. S2 is in, S1 is in the position of truth. Agent of desire, which is S2. Other, the little a, and the product or the loss, which is where the barred subject is here. One simple explanation of this matheme might be as follows. The desire that is consecrated and concretized in university discourse is the desire for knowledge. That is, for a chain of signifiers, which Lacan identifies as ultimately deriving from the work of slaves. This knowledge addresses itself to its other, here formalized as the A, the empty space of what is not known or not yet known, and which can therefore be topics as heterogeneous as God on the one hand, or the criminal classes on another. The little a, this unknown, is what the university, the knowledges of the university direct themselves to. And as I've already tried to briefly sketch, the university can direct itself towards almost any knowledges whatsoever. But what this A, above all, indicates, at least for Lacan, is the so-called student body. The students are precisely the other as little a, the object, abject targets of knowledge, the not yet known nor knowing, the as yet unformed, that material which will have to be integrated into the chain of knowledge. Moreover, the one thing that this knowledge, which can therefore turn itself to knowing anything at all, does not and cannot know, whether it considers itself knowledge of the one, the true and the good, or of knowledge as power, pure or applied, ideal or material, is that its truth remains that of the master as such, the occluded, the repressed S1, the master signifier, that for which it performs its operations. The truth, the S1, and the product, the barred subject of university knowledge, may be irreducible to each other, yet neither can be properly known by the university. However, this lack is not crippling for the university discourse at all. What is produced by the university's operations is to be lost from its knowledges, that is, the division of the subject as such. As such, the work of the university is to turn any old multiplicity, even the multiples of absences, the essence of the student body is missing in action, into countable ones, units, student units, perhaps analogously to the way in which modern experimental psychology turns the living rat into the rat units of laboratory testing. Moreover, these units are counted as such under the heading of the two, the S2, the minimal relational multiple of knowledge. In sum, the university is indeed in the service of a one, the master that never appears nor speaks in propria persona, but whose exigencies are legible in the very knowledge the university produces, and whose primary function is to integrate the unknowing unknowns, the students, into knowing knowns, units. Where un was, there shall units be. The universe seeks to verse the multiple voids it integrates until they are untied into units. The perverse positivism of university discourse is constitutional, not cosmetic. In his own application of Lacan's discourse on the university discourse to institutions more generally, Michel de Certeau discusses how the latter generate their authority precisely by withdrawing from actuality the goods that they promise. It is not in spite of, but because of their hypocrisy, corruption, and failure, which are terms, I'm not saying these are absolutely, but are terms always applied to the structures of universities, and I think have been for, once again, nearly 1,000 years. People are constantly banging on about the hypocrisy, corruption, and failures of the universities to do what they claim to do. But for de Certeau, following Lacan, this is not a bug, but a feature. Moreover, and here's a long quote from de Certeau himself, the positioning of the subject under the sign of refuse is the point where the institution of true discourse is imprinted. And this established discourse transmits itself by tirelessly producing in subjects its conditions of possibility, which is the soothing and moreover truthful confession that those subjects are no more than putrescence. To this sly law of the tradition, transmission of noble doctrine can be added an extreme procedure that has always proliferated along the borders of institutions of truth, and which, far from diminishing like an archaeological phenomenon of history, constantly develops, becoming more and more of a regular administrative practice or a political routine. Torture. End of quote. Torture is evidently a strong word, yet it is precise. It denominates the enforced extraction of signifiers from a resistant body by means of intrusive questioning. In medieval Europe, of course, when you were tortured, you're put to the question. But questiones, or questions, are also one of the forms of treatise that are familiar from this theological apparatus. And so, at least in de Certeau's Lacanian approach, the idea of torture is not simply the application of hot irons, but it depends much more directly on the forced extraction of signifiers from a resistant body by means of questions, and those questions can be in word or deed. Lacan himself notoriously identifies this operation of extraction with the primal scene of philosophical instruction itself, the ridicule of the slave and the theft of their know-how for the master's benefit, before that stolen know-how, translated into abstract knowledge, is reinserted into the slave as persecutory instruction. And this is exactly what is formalized in the part matheme S2 pointing its arrow of desire at little a. Such torture is never made fully obvious, although it remains the ground and limit presupposition of every form of questioning, even if only as a whisper that haunts the institution's exalted and respectable representatives as the attenuator reminder of their own filthiness, their own torturability. Torturability remains the condition of the educator's own continuing employment and enjoyment of their position. The university is the epitome of such an institution of rot. Having offered these preliminary comments, that I can finally say what I came here to say. None of this holds for the contemporary university anymore. Knight himself notes that we are currently undergoing a fifth mutation of the university. The major hallmarks of this shift are relatively well known, clear, and widely discussed. There is a total economization of the university as a whole, according to the single good of profitability, which renders the traditional functions of the university subordinate and peripheral to the exigencies of this profitability. This is, of course, not unique to universities. It's one of the hallmarks of what we now call neoliberalism. Every institution must have one and only one, to advert to the university aspect of it again, one motive, and that's profitability as such. Not even necessarily profit. Profitability is a virtual exigency, not necessarily an actuality. There's no relative autonomy to such an institution, which has been rigorously and deliberately de-autonomized. Such an economization is inseparable from the technological expropriation of the means of communication by network computing. And this seizure has all the consequences ubiquitous today around the world, whether in Pakistan, Australia, Brazil, Korea, I'm presuming, the United States. Asymmetrical surveillance, accelerated securitization, cognitive automation, and unilateral chains of communication. No matter what cries and laments issue regarding the threats to free speech in the contemporary university, it must be said bluntly that there is now no such thing. Concomitantly, we find a continuous disruption of all inherited routines of research and teaching through ceaseless managerial redivision, segregation, and dissemination of tasks, of the components of tasks, of the doing of those tasks, all implemented from a transcendent position. They're not imminent decisions of the scholars and students themselves. They must not be, in fact. The micro-credentialing, the absolute centralization of planning and pyramidal governance structures founded on constant administrative resectioning and reorganization of departments, the outsourcing of key internal functions to competitive external providers, the transformation of delivery, above all through the repurposing of real spaces for commercial ends, the casualization of labor, the use of online tools, as indeed we're engaged in today, and so on. As Bill Readings prophetically put it in The University in Ruins way back in 1996, the university is becoming a transnational bureaucratic corporation. In other words, the new university structure is that of any corporation whatsoever. That is, it is no longer a university. If certain residua of older formations remain in the institutions that still bear the name, their powers, places, personnel, and purpose have been utterly disrupted and pacified. So the university no longer exists. Yet it is not that its functions are no longer with us. On the contrary, if the university as an institution is now essentially defunct, the discourse of the university has never been more pervasive and intense. For what is today sometimes called cognitive capitalism, alongside late capitalism, neoliberalism, without having to pass through the filter of such an expensive and unwieldy, in fact, I nearly said unworldly, exactly, an unworldly institution such as the university. Lacan himself gave an anticipation of these objects in 1970. He called them latus, the personalized automated media devices that give us our access to the alethiosphere, the virtual regime of truth. None of this could be happening today without these latus, with which we hook into the rays of truth that otherwise would be inaccessible to us. The new master, the S1 of our times, is of course digital technology, expressed most directly as the one multiple of swarming mobs, articulated with the multiple one of the network. The university is dead. Long live the discourse of the university. What is left of the university then? There's no longer the generation of authority by projecting an ideal that is never fulfilled, but rather direct imposition of the contemporary forced choice that issues from every fragment of the socius today. Are you a servant or are you waste? The disavowed voice of the torture victim that sustained the institutions of modernity is no longer muffled in basements and barrows and back rooms behind the dissimulating glory of representations of the triumph of knowledge, but radically amplified by the institutions themselves as a standard operating procedure. The extraordinary novelty of our 21st century corporations is the accomplishment of self-dissolution against precisely the liberties, freedoms, and immunities that sovereigns had granted the communities of scholars as the university since the Middle Ages, at the heart of the university itself. I do not mean this metaphorically. It's simply a fact that contemporary management and HR have directly drawn techniques from plantation slavery and concentration camps. Yet these globally regnant managerial techniques hark back to the most ancient settlements of domination. The technologies with which we live today, I would like to say, are probably not new. They're Neolithic in their ambitions. And so the university, after nearly 1,000 years of use to sovereigns and state power, dissipates as a specific institution precisely because it is no longer required for universing the diverse, for turning unknown unknowns into knowing knowns, for submitting the abject to knowledge extraction on the dictates of the hidden master. Having lost its raison d'etre, its mission, and without any further ideas than to conform to the master's will, the university reverts to the basest routines of domination and barbarism. Hence my manifesto for the university: neither a university nor university discourse be. This is evidently an entirely negative declaration, and a useless one, but we could rephrase it more positively in the terms of A.J. Bartlett. What would an education be that wasn't the master's? What would education look like if it was an education by truths? The shame of the situation is, to use a term of Lacan's, outlandish. After all, and this is what Lacan says, that's what psychoanalysis discovers. Be a bit serious. You will notice that the shame is justified by the fact you do not die of shame. That is, by your maintaining with all your force the discourse of the perverted master, which is the university discourse. So the university is gone as an institution at the cost of now being everywhere as a discourse without words, as Lacan says. Or we could also say a discourse without borders, or a discourse without worlds, or a discourse without walls. Every one of us bound as S2s to the elitosphere by such latus as mobile phones and associated hardware. For better or worse, we are unlikely to die from the shame. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Justin. Well, I'm just getting my breath back here. Are there any questions from our audience? People are being very quiet here. There is one online question from Paul Pat, who says, is it possible to break the link between the four discourses so that knowledge wouldn't be subject to the master and could learn how or what it liked?
I think that's the question of the contemporary, absolutely, and it's one of the reasons I guess I invoked Bartlett's work and through I guess Bartlett, Badiou, Rancière, Balabar, a number of the post-Althusserian left students who are still around today. For Lacan himself, yes, there have been many kinds of discourse. But unfortunately, as for better or for worse, as he says, Lacan in the late 60s, early 70s, there's only four discourses left today, i.e., forms of organizing a social bond, and in all of those, even the analytic discourse of which psychoanalysis is the kind of modern representative, even there, the master is non-negotiable. To be a speaking being for Lacan means that that something like a master in the form of a master signifier is always operative, no matter what. And so part of the problem for Lacan is you can't simply get rid of the master without losing absolutely all chances of a discourse of social action, of reforming or re-articulating a kind of social bond. One's unleashed precisely by the loss of the master into something that is possibly for someone like Lacan worse, as he says, or ... or worse. Now, that's not the case, I think, not quite the case for people like, Rancière, Badiou, and Bartlett. The question would be rather, what sort of practices can be implemented? And at this point, they will have to be small, local, experimental, in fact, probably non-communicable in the terms of either the traditional discourses or the new organization of the university discourse by digital technology. There would have to be ways of, Rancière gives some examples in The Ignorant Schoolmaster, for instance. And a few years ago, Bartlett and I co-edited a collection called What is Education, in which there's several other small sorts of suggestions for experimentation around precisely a knowledge that would not be that of the master. One would hope also that decolonial First Nations and other traditional forms of knowledge, or non-colonial forms of knowledge, may have almost definitely lessons to teach everyone about non-conformity, about resistance, and about redistributing something about education which doesn't go through the route, the master's route.
Yes, thank you, Justin. I suppose, there's a question there, isn't there, of whether whether and where the discourses are operative, because I suppose if you're someone like Jacques-Alain Miller, he would say, would he not, that it's only in analysis that the discourses are functioning properly, whereas outside of analysis there is that kind of unbound situation anyway. Isn't that the point? The point is to know whether the discourses are actually functioning outside of the clinic.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I think that's the point about a discourse is not that it receives from Lacan. These are kind of, I guess, synecdochal appellations on his part: the analytic discourse, the university discourse, the master's discourse, the hysterics discourse are the four that matter to him. But those discourses, those are emblematic names. They're not. And so the problem, I think, particularly today, in what I guess I'd call the expropriation of the means of communication from human beings, and they're basically de-autonomization and automation through forms of new media, AI, and other operations, is actually have to rethink. The relationship between the inside and the outside has been completely transformed by these things, right? And so that's why I wanted to say that the university today is like not actually in the university, which is just has become a corporation organized like any other corporation. But it doesn't mean that there's no university discourse. On the contrary, university discourse now seems to be maybe the preeminent and dominant discourse of our times. I don't think most Lacanians would say this, but I'm saying it along the lines that I've been trying to indicate today, that if you take a kind of formula for the university as something that turns unknowing unknowns into knowing knowns, then there's nothing better than a mobile phone for doing that to you. You carry it with you at all times. You access all information on it. You constantly allow it to interrupt you at any moment, even if you're in a situation which is important and you're talking to other people. You're fondling it. It nestles next to your groin or your bum, maybe, depending on where you slot the thing. But you don't let it out of your side, and you don't let it out of your possession. and you do pretty much every communicative thing on it. And what do you do on it? It's a kind of capitalism as a cult object. The kind of ultimate fetish object of university discourse comes in these devices, which themselves are clearly turning you into you're tracked, you're surveyed, etc., etc. We all know all of these things. It's all quite banal. But the main point is that you're being you're turning yourself happily and enthusiastically into a knowing known under these conditions, and which is also, to come back to the de Certeau point, tantamount to something like torture, even if you feel that it's pleasurable. Why? Because it's the enforced extraction of signifiers, or at least signification of chains of knowledge from your body under conditions of non-volition. These are abstract formula, I understand, but nonetheless they affect very, very significantly, all of the ways in which we should think about what are the powers of discourse, what are the powers of changing discourse, what are the powers of education, and so on. And at the moment, there's a universal school, and we call it the smartphone.
Yes, absolutely. I don't know if any. Yeah, I mean, Alex, would you? We have to come here, right? If you want to ask a question, because I can't bring the microphone to you. But please come down, please, Alex.
Stage player.
I know.
Hi, Justin. I'm Alex.
Hey.
I'm colleague
Hi,
of
Alex.
Jason. Yeah, thank you for your fantastic talk today. And then, yeah, I'm very impressed actually, when you talk about the kind of, the opposite effect of university discourse. I'm really interesting how it's such a the reversion could happen against the end of or death of the university education. Actually, what occurred to me is when listening to actually your talk, exactly the modern university is definitely invention of Europe, is a kind of European legacy. And then, in my opinion, what we actually faced up with such a crisis of university is definitely this, European legacy, European tradition of university.
Yeah.
So that's why I think we can find out very interesting clue in your talk. Actually, university is dead, but long live actually university discourse. That is very important. But the question, and then some kind of the more elaboration about your idea is definitely how can we actually build up such an alliance, in the reversing that kind of discourse. For instance, in non-European the country like Korea and then other Asian country, these days Myanmar, that is the old the country. One day it was called Burma,
Yeah, Burma.
And then also actually in the Hong Kong, and then even in Japan, you could find out actually that kind of European university came into these countries, non-European sector, and then it turned to be a very strange, actually already that kind of reversion of a university discourse happened. In colonized Korea, for instance, lots of Marxists, who was evicted from their own mainland in Japan, and came to the Korea, and then they actually they took the position of a professor, and they teaching the Marxism, and then it was kind of the discursive foundation of this sort of a liberation movement. Such a thing happened, and then even actually Lacan and lots of French philosophy, came to Asian country, and then it actually inspired lots of activists, and then even though actually they are very privileged people, all right, actually they're born into a middle class, the family, and then even upper class family. But they organized that sort of, activism against, the imperialism of their own government, authoritarian government. This is very interesting, and then that's why I want to actually, raise some question about your, the idea, the relation between technology and university the discourse. You said, of course, it's technology, according to Bernard Stiegler, and then lots of actually, philosophers of the technology argue that technology kind of the categorization and then reproduction of such a master signifier, the master discourse. But thing is that this technology would be used to build up that kind of international alliance, or just like us, we're using this kind of technology, and then so that's actually my the further question about your talk about the idea. How can we use this technology, and then how can we understand this sort of geographical differences, the influence that sort of the different practice of university discourse, and how can we build up the international alliance for the further this kind of activism. Thank you.
Yes, absolutely. Really, I guess these are the really crucial questions, and thank you for asking. Obviously, I have no helpful answers, I guess I would say, except I see that one of the functions of the university is, in its precisely universing, its turn towards the one, or the turning of the one, is to have the effect of colonializing. It has a certain essentially colonializing aspect, is that all other forms of knowledge must be able to be integrated into the university or be dismissed as knowledge, right? Or be discounted as knowledge. It's at least one of the recurrent and dominant functions of the university, is precisely to make knowledge in such a way that it's impossible to think of real knowledge that doesn't go through those routines at all, right? And hence, when it always comes as a kind of that's why I say even with the integration of students that are European into the University of Paris in the 14th century, there's necessarily riots all the time because these little object A's don't want to be integrated, right? Or don't entirely want to be integrated, or don't entirely. So there is always a resistance. But then the point about the resistance is, how is it to always ask that question? How is it possible to use that resistance, which doesn't either totally avoid the university altogether and fall into desuetude, or simply get integrated, exactly as you pointed out, by the university, where the university, even in its goal of it's a universal sort of operation, because it wants to bring even Marxist and heretical knowledges in. And once heretical and Marxist knowledges are brought in, yes, they can still have some effects, but those effects are still, and they can be quite unexpected, and they can seem quite counterintuitive. But nonetheless, those effects are still part of the operations of this oneing, or the universing of the diverse that universities project. And today we're in this terrible situation where all the institutions that are called universities, you're captured by those as employment. Basically, you're basically in servitude to them as an employee, or you're turned into waste. But also at the same time, everyone's already being universitized now by contemporary technology. So we have to find a way to neither think that this technology will save us, nor that a God will save us, of course, but nor that the old institutions will save us either, since that dialectic is almost part of the problem itself, and not least because, as I guess I heard you imply too, is that as people connected to the university, you, me, Jason, and so on, in one form or another, we like it. It has done really great things for us, as and that's part of its alibi of jouissance, or its alibi of kind of pleasure and surplus pleasure. But we shouldn't let our own surplus pleasures, dictate the terms for everyone else. So that's all I think I can say. And unfortunately, once again, I think it's a sadly negative and impotent account, but it's the best that I've got.
No, I think Justin. I mean, I was just thinking as you were talking, because I'm sure I detected a reference in there somewhere. I mean, we must avoid a kind of Jacobite rebellion, right? We must avoid turning ourselves into kind of young pretenders in opposing the empire, right? In being anti-colonialists, Alex, we must avoid just repetition, basically, right? I mean, that's the, you know, avoid the Jacobite Rebellion. I mean, that's not the answer. Actually, it's you know, if you want to be president, right? If you want to be master, you have to wear the master's clothes, and that's kind of the difficulty there. I mean, I suppose it would be. Yeah, I mean, as university workers, no one's really spoken much about workers yet. But I was just thinking, and I was jotting down a few, making a few notes back there as you were speaking. I suppose just to kind of really break down what you're saying, and you know, just as much for my own understanding as for everyone else's, the university has become a victim of its own success. You know, to the point that it's in your phone. It's there. It's always there, right? It's always already there. And I wonder if I would say, from a kind of liberal perspective, there are maybe three consequences, and these are three consequences that I think we're all experiencing. Because as you were talking, I was, again, as I always am, you know, starting to reflect on what this means now, right? Because we are living through a kind of strange, very strange and period at the moment. But the first and most obvious consequence, I suppose, of this, and this kind of ubiquity of university discourse, would be that the university itself closes, right? So that's obviously happening. I mean, it's been happening in the longer term anyway. Massification leads to oversupply, leads to bankruptcy, redundancy. So it's kind of happening in the kind of longer term. But it's happening in the short term too, right? The university now is closed indefinitely. We don't know when this institution is going to reopen and under what conditions, what are the new kind of technologies and so on, which are either facilitating its reopening or its partial reopening or its continued and indefinite closure. So there's that. Secondly, I suppose, and this is, you know, this has democratic as well as anti-democratic implications. The second consequence, I suppose, would be that the students become masters, right? Which is already sort of happening anyway. I mean, in the sense that students are now being asked to sort of design courses, constantly feeding back on the kind of the quality of their education. The customer is always right anyway, right? So in that sense, you know, students are becoming, in this kind of weird liberal sense, the masters, and the kind of masters are sort of becoming redundant almost, right? And the third consequence that strikes me here, which is, I don't quite know how to put it, but it's a very kind of Lacanian consequence, would be that the sort of knowledge now, or that knowledge could be, as a sort of, as a kind of antidote to that ubiquity of university discourse, knowledge could be delimited by school, right? Or that the students would actually recognize their masters as masters. So I wonder if that, and that third consequence is kind of the most interesting. I mean, I'm not really articulating it very clearly, but that sense in which, of course, Lacan was constantly, you know, or the kind of psychoanalytical movement in France was constantly splitting into schools, right the way through to the end of his life, to the last weeks of his life, right? He set up another school. Was it the Freudian Field School or something at the very end? You're probably more aware of that than me, right? But, you know, this idea that, you know, university discourse, ubiquity of knowledge, you actually delimit knowledge within a particular school. It's very precise disciplinary rules and regulations, and you know, in terms of teaching and transmission of knowledge and so on. That seems to be kind of the most interesting consequence potentially of this university discourse. Do you have any ideas about that, Justin? I'm rambling a bit here.
Look, the first thing is I like very much like the title of Stephen Knight's book, which is called "The University is Closed for Open Day." which was a sign that he came across at the open day, so he couldn't. So I think that says everything pretty clearly. The university is closed for open day. Now, to come back to the problem of the students becoming the masters as one of the examples that you've given, or other sorts of workers within the university framework, the universities are exceedingly traditionally hierarchical places, right? An incredible complexity of inherited sort of occupations, including until, I think maybe even till the present day, the official rat catcher, for instance, of Cambridge University. Now, however, the relations, and we can't minimize the history of those, of all of the divisions within those universities, those university structures, and they're often very, very different. One of the things that has happened today, and particularly accelerated since I think the 1980s, 1990s, is that management technologies are not making students masters, but placing. A master isn't someone who just decides, or student preferences. Students don't decide. The customer is not always right, but if you survey and control and elicit from the students sets of those preferences can be used by management to be injected back into the employability of the old masters, of the lecturers and the professors themselves. And so what you get is like the deliberate inculcation of a sense of false mastery by sort of managerial tactics, even to exacerbate and accelerate the hyperdivision and the impotence of all of the different alleged positions and the alleged power differentials accompanying those positions. And that, of course, then gives everyone the phantasm that there are positions that are iniquitously in iniquitous positions of power, and that these positions are really separate, that these positions are actually really distinct, when in fact these positions are now confections of managerialism rather than anything that we would recognize as real situations of the maître, for instance, or of mastery. And this is one of the things that, to come back to the problem of managerialism, the managerial manotech, as I call it, is definitely has accelerated, and it really is, as I mentioned in passing, but there's no question that it's drawn from the techniques of modern management, and all of the corporations we work in today. These big corporations have been drawn from the management of plantation slavery and the Shoah, so of concentration camps. That's the example you gave of students as a prime example of that. Another example, another flashpoint I would give, which is happening currently in Australia, is that there's been massive casualisation of the workforce of Australian teaching universities over the last 20 years, really outrageous, but also simultaneously massive wage theft of the pay that's owed to casuals, even under these exploitative conditions. And the universities are currently in dispute with casuals unions and the unions over things that are like hundreds of millions of dollars of non-payment to the most precarious precarious aspects of the university workforce. I see all of these as symptoms of the problem of what a worker is under these conditions, and an absolute disruption and destabilization, a self-dissolution on the part of the university to be anything other than a rent-seeking corporation. But again, and finally, the important thing, and to come back to what you said about schools, let's face it, all over the world, there's many, unbelievably thousands of different models for education, right? Whether it's the academy, as Bartlett spoke about last week, which is now the name, which now is synonymous with the university, but it's not quite that, or the lyceum or the gymnasium, just to even just draw on silly, the idea of a school, which Lacan called his enterprise, a school, not a university. It's not a university where he does. The psychoanalytic training institutions are really universities as well, right? So we are at the chance we have now is to proliferate and draw on, you know, I guess, indigenous and non-standard counter traditions of education. But above all, what we need is an idea that is anything more than just making money, that is more than profitability. And dare I say it, if it's an idea, then it has to be an idea that isn't segregative or divisive as well. So it's the part of the problem we have is exactly to quote Bartlett again, you know, what would an education by truths look like? By truths, i.e. something that is for all, compelling, delegitimizes both inherited structures but also economic domination and so
on. I'm delighted, actually. We have another question from Daniel Tutt. I'm sure it's the same Daniel Tutt, right? Thanks, Daniel. It's great to hear from you. He says, hi, Justin. Great talk. I'm wondering what you think about the effect of shame. Lacan says that we have suffered from a lack of shame, and he also says that his discourse brings shame. And continuing, so how do you theorize the role of shame in the contemporary academic setting? Is there a role for shame as Lacan brought about? Are we shameless or too ashamed?
Yes, it's this is why. Thank you for that question. It really is the question of affect, if we can put it like that, and the question of shame as an absolutely fundamental and fundamental affect of what the insertion of a living body into a signifying process for Lacan, because shame is absolutely, you are exposed, you are being seen, you know that you're being seen, you know that you're an object, as someone like Sartre would say, in the eyes of the other, and you want to die of it. Now, that's why Lacan talks about ontology, like ont being shame, like, you know, obviously Derrida would later talk about hauntology, but once again, Lacan was first, and dare I say, a little more shameless in his nominations. The shame is absolutely crucial. It's constitutive to a living. One of the constitutive affects of a living body being subject to a signifying chain. Now, why don't we die of it if you actually start to take the shame that you should feel seriously? Historically, hardly anyone dies of it. Actually, we go on living with our shame. And one of the things that Lacan also, I think, indicates, particularly in Seminar 17, but also elsewhere, is that this shame is literally outlandish. It's beyond the call of duty. It seems to be what enables us to continue to not die from the shame. We're justifying our own shame by not dying of it, because we're maintaining with all our force a discourse of the perverted master, that is the university discourse itself. So is there a way that we can continue to live with this shame that we don't die from only at the moment by supporting ourselves with this discourse of the perverted master? I'm sorry, that's just a reformulation of your question. But I think it's absolutely the real one, because but it is the real question, and it's a question both of subjectification and desubjectification simultaneously. So I think part of the question to that, since people like talking about affect, shame is the one that I'm interested in. How do we detach ourselves from a university discourse and not die of shame? There's something that university discourse is doing, which is why it's now fucking ubiquitous, right? It's not just an alienating thing that comes from outside that takes us over and we're all very sorry, and if only we could do without it. Part of Lacan's point is you cannot just do without it, because as soon as you lose that discourse, it's a social bond. You yourself are at risk of dying of the shame that you necessarily feel. As Primo Levi says, again in the context of the shower here, if this be a man, the shame of being a man he speaks about. That's exactly where Lacan is. It's a very, very limit discourse. And so once again, I have nothing but my impotence to show, which is, of course, a university impotence and shameful in itself, but protecting me from dying of this shame. Is the question is, can we find a discourse that will enable us to live with the shame that is, again, not the discourse of the master, i.e. not a university discourse? Because that would be the lesson I would draw, a negative lesson from Lacan, is what stops us from dying of shame is university discourse itself, and we need it for that reason. So we will not be able to do without it. That is this sort of knowing known, this schooling that we have. I'm sorry, that's the best I can do.
Thanks very much, Justin. I mean, have you got time for a couple? There's a couple more questions here.
I've got time for a couple more.
Couple more. Yeah, I don't want to exhaust you there. So Sungjae is saying, Justin, thank you for the good lecture. Have a question. The university was capitalized and became institutions that reproduce capitalist values, but COVID-19 has been changing capitalist values. It no longer relies solely on the market. The government distributes masks to the people and gives support funds. Do you think there's a possibility that capitalism will change into an equal society in the post-COVID era?
Yeah, and thank you for that question. It's a real hope that I would have had. I would say absolutely not. Like what we're and one of the reasons for that is that the kind of ubiquitization of the Latours, of the devices that we need. Capitalism is just going to drive all the way, at this point, it's going to drive all the way to the end. And even what we think of as the modern state or the still existing nation states, they themselves are at the limits of their viability. As I think William Burroughs put it, maybe even back in the 1950s, in the future we won't say, oh, I'm an American, or I'm a Korean, or I'm an Australian. We'll say, I work for Shell, I work for Facebook, I work for what is the new form of the super state? It's actually the tech companies themselves. Amazon, I work for Amazon, and we know where that's going to go. And that's why I say one of the forced choices, adverting to one of Lacan's concepts from 4 fundamental concepts of psychoanalysis, is that of the forced choice, where he uses the example of the highwayman who holds you up, says, your money or your life. Well, either you die there by refusing to give the money, or you give up your money and then you can't live because you don't have any money to live, so you're going to die. Now, I see that in the current mass situation, in the global situation, even with this minimal redistribution of resources, absolutely minimal by nation states, the choice for us is servitude or waste. Are you going to be just thrown away as a piece of human filth, or are you going to work under the most extreme conditions that are approaching slavery again? That's the forced choice of contemporary capitalism. And these mechanisms that seem to be happening with COVID are in fact residual and incredibly minor, given what can and should be being done.
Yes, thank you. I'm just thinking of going back to shame, Marx's letter to Ruger, from 1843. What was it? If a whole nation felt a sense of shame, it would be like a lion crouching ready to spring,
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Well, it's in that's a kind of very British, I think, even for Marx thing to say, like like a kind of the, Blake, like a strong man rousing himself after sleep. If we dealt with this, if we tried to deal with this shame in a way that was not of the university, what is it that we would be capable of? But it would have to be connected to an idea that is neither that of the master and therefore not the university, but also isn't one simply of allowing the shame to overwhelm us and dying, right?
Yes, indeed. Yeah, that was the young Marx, actually, wasn't it? That was the.
He's a young guy then.
He's a young guy. He's kind of making a young guy. He was on a barge, I think, when he wrote that letter. It's quite an interesting letter, actually. But it's funny because we don't have Rug's letters, right? I mean, even when they
response.
were, I mean, it's almost like, you know, kind of narcissistic sort of, you know, love poem or something. But it was, I mean, is Rug there? I mean, does he ever respond? It's weird, actually. But yeah, yes. Well, listen. Any final? I don't think we have any final questions. Just. You probably won't get a chance like this again, right? We don't have Justin every day on the line, so
half your luck.
Yeah. No? Anyone else? I can't see any other messages coming through. I'll have to drop Daniel a line. I haven't. That'd be good. Have a chat with Daniel at some stage. Thanks for joining us, Daniel. And thank all of you actually. Thank you everyone for joining us and for you coming here today. We'll be back next week with Alex. But I suppose if that's really everything, yeah, no one has any questions, then it just remains for me to say, Justin, thank you ever so much. It was an absolute delight and an honour and a privilege. I'm so sorry for all those technical issues and hold-ups, and I won't bore our online audience and our guests here with all of the hassles and rigmarole that we went through to get this live stream up and running. But thanks very much. Thanks, Justin. Thanks, Sungjae. Thanks, Dennis, in the control room for doing such a great job. But Justin, above all, thank you very much, and let's do this again sometime.
Absolutely, thank you, Jason.
And yes, stay well, and in these lockdown times, and at the end of the university, right? Stay well at the end of the university.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway,
ciao.
Thanks a lot. Thanks, Justin. See you. If we're still live, right? Yeah. Just to say, just a message for the audience. Please check out our websites for updates. This is not a university.com, and our YouTube channel. This is not a university, and because it's possible that some of those times and dates, not so much the times and dates, but the URL links. Yeah, it's possible that sometimes we need to change those at relatively short notice. So please, you know, anything that's scheduled there, make sure it's really going to be broadcast, and that we haven't changed the link to the broadcast. So thanks very much. Thanks a lot.